Okay, guys, here comes chapter 4 of the Pearl. It's a little lengthy, so that's why I wanted to read it so that you could listen and follow along with the pictures as I read. Make sure you're answering your 2 ROW questions about chapter 4 of the Pearl. It is wonderful the way a little town keeps track of itself and of all of its units. If every single man and woman, child and baby acts and conducts itself in a known pattern and breaks no walls and differs with no one and experiments in no way and is not sick and does not endanger the ease and peace of mind or steady unbroken flow of the town, then that unit can disappear and never be heard of. But let one man step out of the regular thought or the known and trusted pattern, and the nerves of the townspeople ring with nervousness, and communication travels over the nerve lines of the town. Then every unit communicates to the whole. Thus, in La Paz, it was known in the early morning through the whole town that Kino was going to sell his pearl that day. It was known among the neighbors in the brush huts, among the pearl fishermen. It was known among the Chinese grocery store owners. It was known in the church, for the altar boys whispered about it. Word of it crept in among the nuns. The beggars in front of the church spoke of it, for they would be there to take the teeth of the first fruits of luck. The little boys knew about it with excitement, but most of all the pearl buyers knew about it, and when the day had come in the offices of the pearl buyers, each man sat alone with his little black velvet tray, and each man rolled the pearls about with his fingertips and considered his part in the picture. It was supposed to be that the pearl buyers were individuals acting alone, bidding against one another for the pearls the fishermen brought in, and once it had been so. But this was a wasteful method, for often, in the excitement of bidding for a fine pearl, too great a price had been paid to the fishermen. This was extravagant and could not be countenanced. Now there was only one pearl buyer with many hands, and the men who sat in their offices and waited for Kino knew what price they would offer, how high they would bid, and what method each one would use. And although these men would not profit beyond their salaries, there was an excitement among the pearl buyers, for there was excitement in the hunt, and if it be a man's function to break down a price, then he must take joy and satisfaction in breaking it as far down as possible. For every man in the world functions to the best of his ability, and no one does less than his best, no matter what he might think about it. Quite apart from any reward they might get, from any word of praise, from any promotion, a pearl buyer was a pearl buyer, and the best and happiest pearl buyer was he who bought for the lowest prices. The sun was hot yellow that morning, and it drew the moisture from the estuary and from the gulf and hung it in shimmering scarves in the air, so that the air vibrated and vision was insubstantial. A vision hung in the air to the north of the city, the vision of a mountain that was over 200 miles away, and the high slopes of this mountain were swaddled with pines, and a great stone peak arose above the timberline. And the morning of this day the canoes lay lined up on the beach. The fishermen did not go out to dive for pearls, for there would be too much happening, too many things to see when Kino went to sell the great pearl. In the brush houses by the shore, Kino's neighbors sat long over their breakfasts, and they spoke of what they would do if they had found the pearl. And one man said that he would give it as a present to the Holy Father in Rome. Another said that he would buy masses for the souls of his family for 1,000 years. Another thought he might take the money and distribute it among the poor of La Paz. And a fourth thought of all the good things one could do with the money from the pearl, of all the charities, benefits, of all the rescues one could perform if one had money. All of the neighbors hoped that sudden wealth would not turn Kino's head, would not make a rich man of him, would not graft onto him the evil limbs of greed and hatred and coldness. For Kino was a well-liked man. It would be a shame if the pearl destroyed him. That good wife Juana, they said, and the beautiful baby Coyotito, and the others to come, what a pity it would be if the pearl should destroy them all. For Kino and Juana, this was the morning of mornings of their lives, comparable only to the day when the baby had been born. This was to be the day from which all other days would take their arrangement. Thus they would say, "It was 2 years before we sold the pearl," or "It was 6 weeks after we sold the pearl." Juana, considering the matter, threw caution to the winds, and she dressed Coyotito in the clothes she had prepared for his baptism, when there would be money for his baptism. And Juana combed and braided her hair and tied the ends with 2 little bows of red ribbon, and she put on her marriage skirt and waist. The sun was quarter high when they were ready. Kino's ragged white clothes were clean at least, and this was the last day of his raggedness. For tomorrow, or even this afternoon, he would have new clothes. The neighbors, watching Kino's door through the crevices in their brush houses, were dressed and ready too. There was no self-consciousness about their joining Kino and Juana to go pearl selling. It was expected. It was an historic moment. They would be crazy if they didn't go. It would be almost a sign of unfriendship. Juana put on her head shawl carefully, and she draped one long end under her right elbow and gathered it in her right hand so that a hammock hung under her arm. And in this little hammock she placed Coyotito, propped up against the head shawl so that he could see everything, and perhaps remember. Kino put on his large straw hat and felt it with his hand to see that it was properly placed, not on the back or side of his head, like a rash, unmarried, irresponsible man, and not flat as an elder would wear it, but tilted a little forward to show aggressiveness and seriousness and vigor. There was a great deal to be seen in the tilt of a hat on a man. Kino slipped his feet into his sandals and pulled the thongs up over his heels. The great pearl was wrapped in an old, soft piece of deerskin and placed in a little leather bag, and the leather bag was in a pocket in Kino's shirt. He folded his blanket carefully and draped it in a narrow strip over his left shoulder. And now they were ready. Kino stepped with dignity out of the house, and Juana followed him, carrying Coyotito. And as they marched up the freshet-washed alley toward the town, the neighbors joined them. The houses belched people. The doorways spewed out children. But because of the seriousness of the occasion, only one man walked with Kino, and that was his brother, Juan Tomas. Juan Tomas cautioned his brother. "You must be careful to see that they do not cheat you," he said. "And very careful," Kino agreed. "We do not know what prices are paid in other places," said Juan Tomas. "How can we know what is a fair price if we do not know what the pearl buyer gets for the pearl in another place?" "That is true," said Kino. "But how can we know? We are here. We are not there." As they walked up toward the city, the crowd grew behind them, and Juan Tomas, in pure nervousness, went on speaking. "Before you were born, Kino," he said, "the old ones thought of a way to get more money for their pearls. They thought it would be better if they had an agent who took all the pearls to the capital and sold them there and kept only his share of the profit." Kino nodded his head. "I know," he said. "It was a good thought." "And so they got such a man," said Juan Tomas, "and they pooled their pearls, and they started him off. And he was never heard of again, and the pearls were lost. Then they got another man, and they started him off, and he was never heard of again. And so they gave the whole thing up and went back to the old way." "I know," said Kino. "I have heard our father tell of it. It was a good idea, but it was against religion, and the father made that very clear. The loss of the pearl was a punishment visited on those who tried to leave their station. And the father made it clear that each man and woman is like a soldier sent by God to guard some part of the castle of the universe. And some are in the ramparts, and some far deep in the darkness of the walls. But each one must remain faithful to his post, and must not go running about, else the castle is in danger from the assaults of hell." "I have heard him make that sermon," said Juan Tomas. "He makes it every year." The brothers, as they walked along, squinted their eyes a little, as they and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers had done for 400 years, since the first strangers came with argument and authority and gunpowder to back up both. In the 400 years, Kino's people had learned only one defense: a slight slitting of the eyes, and a slight tightening of the lips, and a retirement. Nothing could break down this wall, and they could remain whole within the wall. The gathering procession was solemn, for they sensed the importance of this day, and any children who showed a tendency to scuffle, to scream, to cry out, to steal hats and rumple hair were hissed to silence by their elders. So important was this day that an old man came to see, riding on the stalwart shoulders of his nephew. The procession left the brush huts and entered the stone and plaster city, where the streets were a little wider, and there were narrow pavements beside the buildings. And as before, the beggars joined them as they passed the church. The grocers looked out at them as they went by. The little saloons lost their customers, and the owners closed up shop and went along. And the sun beat down on the streets of the city, and even tiny stones threw shadows on the ground. The news of the approach of the procession ran ahead of it, and in their little dark offices the pearl buyers stiffened and grew alert. They got out papers so that they could be at work when Kino appeared, and they put their pearls in the desks, for it was not good to let an inferior pearl be seen beside a beauty. And word of the loveliness of Kino's pearl had come to them. The pearl buyers' offices were clustered together in one narrow street, and they were barred at the windows, and wooden slats cut out of the light, so that only a soft gloom entered the offices. A stout man sat in an office waiting. His face was fatherly and benign, and his eyes twinkled with friendship. He was a caller of good mornings, a ceremonious shaker of hands, a jolly man who knew all jokes, and yet who hovered close to sadness. For in the midst of a laugh he could remember the death of your aunt, and his eyes could become wet with sorrow for your loss. This morning he had placed a flower in a vase on his desk, a single scarlet hibiscus, and the vase sat beside the black velvet-lined pearl tray in front of him. He was shaved close to the blue roots of his beard, and his hands were clean and his nails polished. His door stood open in the morning, and he hummed under his breath while his right hand practiced legerdemain. I think that means to practice his handwriting. Anyways, he rolled the coin back and forth over his knuckles and made it appear and disappear, made it spin and sparkle. The coin winked into the sight and as quickly slipped out of sight, and the man did not even watch his own performance. The fingers did it all mechanically, precisely, while the man hummed to himself and peered out the door. Then he heard the tramp of feet of the approaching crowd, and the fingers of his right hand worked faster and faster until the figure of Kino filled the doorway. The coin flashed and disappeared. "Good morning, my friend," the stout man said. "What can I do for you?" Kino stared into the dimness of the little office, for his eyes were squeezed from the outside glare. But the buyer's eyes had become as steady and cruel and unwinking as a hawk's eyes, while the rest of his face smiled in greeting, and secretly, behind his desk, his right hand practiced with the coin. "I have a pearl," said Kino, and Juan Tomas stood beside him and snorted a little at the understatement. The neighbors peered around the doorway, and a line of little boys clambered on the window bars and looked through. Several little boys, on their hands and knees, watched the scene around Kino's leg. "You have a pearl," the dealer said. "Sometimes a man brings in a dozen. Well, let us see your pearl. We will value it and give you the best price." and his fingers worked furiously with the coin. Now Kino instinctively knew his own dramatic effects. Slowly, he brought out the leather bag, slowly took from it the soft and dirty piece of deerskin, and then he let the great pearl roll into the black velvet tray, and instantly his eyes went to the buyer's face. But there was no sign, no movement. The face did not change, but the secret hand behind the desk missed in its precision. The coin stumbled over a knuckle and slipped silently into the dealer's lap, and the fingers behind the desk curled into a fist. Then the right hand came out of hiding. The forefinger touched the great pearl, rolled it on the black velvet. Thumb and forefinger picked it up and brought it near to the dealer's eyes and twirled it in the air. Kino held his breath, and the neighbors held their breath, and the whispering went back through the crowd. He is inspecting it. No price has been mentioned yet. They have not come to a price. Now the dealer's hand had become a personality. The hand tossed the great pearl back into the tray. The forefinger poked and insulted it, and on the dealer's face there came a sad and contemptuous smile. "I am sorry, my friend," he said, and his shoulders rose a little to